in the earliest days of his memory, long before the world turned to shadow and sorrow, Obito Uchiha was just a boy chasing light. The kind of boy who lingered too long, watching sunbeams flicker through the leaves, who fell behind during training because he stopped to help an old man carry firewood, who smiled too easily and dreamed too loudly of becoming Hokage. In the quiet corner of the hidden leaf, where the rustle of trees met the soft sound of laughter, Obito's heart beat with the vibrant hope only the very young possess. His world, though modest, was one rich in feeling. A boy with a heart bigger than his stature and a dream far larger than what others believed he could carry. From the beginning, Obito was marked not by genius, nor by extraordinary lineage in the eyes of the village, but by sheer will, by a tenderness that was often mistaken for weakness. He wanted to be noticed, to be valued, to be someone whose name meant something in the annals of the village's future. And yet, obscured beneath the rising star of Kakashi Hatake, the boy prodigy, Obito often stood in shadow. Their rivalry, if it could be called that, was uneven. Where Kakashi was stoic and precise, Obito was emotional and scattered. But still, he smiled. Still, he hoped. Still, he ran to catch up. The weight of being left behind never fully dimmed his spirit. Not yet. Instead, it fueled a fire within him, a quiet blaze born not of vengeance or bitterness, but of the sincere desire to prove himself worthy. And in that soft flicker, the shape of a future far different from the one he would ultimately claim began to form. In those early days, Rin was the light that steadied his gaze. Gentle, attentive, kind. She saw something in Obito that others overlooked. When he stumbled, she encouraged. When he failed, she smiled. And Obito, in the sacred silence of his heart, came to believe that if he could become strong enough, brave enough, she might look at him the way she looked at Kakashi. He never said it aloud. He didn't need to. The tenderness in his gaze spoke volumes every time he looked at her. She became his anchor, his compass, his quiet North Star. Team Minato was a mosaic of contradictions. Minato, the future fourth Hokage, carried wisdom beyond his years, a kindness that never faltered. Kakashi, the genius weighed down by grief and discipline. Rin, the warmth in the middle of the storm. And Obito, the clumsy, spirited one who brought light to their shadows. Their missions, though simple at first, became the forge through which their bonds were tested and tempered. Even Kakashi, so often cold and aloof, began to recognize the strange, stubborn strength within Obito. It was not the strength of technique or skill, but the strength of heart, the kind of strength that never gives up on those he loves. But the world has a way of breaking even the strongest hearts, of twisting light until it becomes something unrecognizable. On one mission, beneath the suffocating pressure of war, everything changed. a trap, falling rocks. Obito pinned beneath the earth, his body broken, but his spirit still burning. In those final moments, he gave Kakashi the gift of sight. His Sharingan awakened, not through training, but through overwhelming emotion. The need to protect. With Rin's trembling hands covered in his blood, Obito smiled through the pain, not for himself, but because he believed he had finally done something meaningful. Finally been a hero. And then darkness. But death did not claim him. Not completely. Beneath the wreckage, a man waited. Madara Uchiha, ancient, manipulative, waiting for a vessel to continue the dream he had abandoned in the flesh, but preserved in spirit. He saved Obito, not out of mercy, but because he saw in the boy a tool, a broken heart waiting to be twisted. And Obito, awakening in that cavern of shadows, with half his body reconstructed from Hashirama's cells, stared into the face of a future he had never imagined. He cried out for Rin, for Kakashi, for the world he had left behind. But only the voice of Madara answered, calm, deliberate, poisonous. At first, Obito resisted. He tried to escape, crawling with bloodied hands toward a light that no longer existed. And then, when he finally returned to the world, when he saw the truth of what had become of Rin, her heart pierced by Kakashi's own hand to prevent her capture, something inside him shattered. Not just sadness, not just loss, but a total collapse of everything he had believed in. In that moment, the boy who had dreamed of becoming Hokage died. What rose in his place was something colder, more resolute, a shadow shaped by pain and purpose. No longer Obito, now a ghost wearing a mask, a man who would carve a new world from the ruins of the one that had betrayed him. He returned to Madara, not as a captive, but as a willing student. The dream of the infinite Tsukuyomi took root in his mind, a dream that promised no more pain, no more separation, no more heartbreak. He would become the architect of this new reality. He would erase the past and build a world where no one had to suffer as he had. And if that required lies, betrayal, manipulation, so be it. Obito became Tobi, a masked enigma, orchestrating chaos from the shadows, always watching, always pulling strings. He manipulated the Akatsuki, turning what was once a rebellion against injustice into a weapon of war. He whispered into the ears of powerful men, twisted their ideals, and turned them into tools. Pain, Konan, Kisame Deidara, all pawns on a board, whose endgame only Obito understood. He wove a web of deception so intricate that even those closest to him had no idea who he truly was. And all the while, the face beneath the mask remained haunted by a name no one spoke. Obito. A name buried beneath years of rage, buried beneath a dream that was never truly his. Yet even in his coldest moments, the ghost of who he once was never fully faded. In the quiet between battles, when the world was silent and his mask was heavy upon his face, Obito would remember. He would see Rin's smile, hear Kakashi's laughter, feel the warmth of the sun on his back. And in those moments, a crack would form in the armor, a whisper of regret, a flicker of light. But it was not enough. Not yet. The world had to burn before it could be reborn. That was the mantra he repeated. That was the belief that kept him moving forward, deeper into darkness. He told himself that the ends justified the means, that the pain he caused was nothing compared to the pain he had suffered. He was no longer a boy dreaming of Hokage. He was the storm that would wash everything away. And yet, within that storm, the eye remained calm, still, quiet, waiting for the moment when the truth would rise again, when the mask would fall, when the boy named Obito would finally look upon the world he had reshaped and begin to see it for what it truly was. The war was not declared with trumpets or banners, but with whispers that grew into roars. Obito moved like a ghost through the waking world, his every action calculated, his every word laced with dual meanings. To the world, he was Tobi, a jester behind a spiral mask, unpredictable and strange. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. Cold, tactical, consumed by vision. The Akatsuki became his instrument, and he played each member like a note in a symphony of suffering. With each step, he brought the world closer to ruin, one silent move at a time. He feigned allegiance to Nagato, to his vision of peace through pain. But in truth, Obito only needed the Rinnegan and the chaos it would bring. Every tragedy was a stepping stone. Every ally was disposable. It wasn't cruelty that guided him. It was detachment. The belief that nothing in this broken world was worth clinging to. Not friends, not nations, not even life itself. Only the dream remained. And so he collected the tailed beasts, piece by piece. He unleashed pain upon villages that had already known too much of it. He wore the name of Madara like a cloak, using its legacy to cast a larger shadow than he could ever manage on his own. The name alone made Kage tremble, and with it, he turned fear into obedience. He waged a war not just of bodies, but of minds. Even Kabuto, with all his twisted brilliance, could not fully unmask him. No one could. Because Obito had buried the truth so deeply within himself, it was nearly lost, even to him. But in the swirl of war and ambition, old names began to resurface. Kakashi, Naruto. Names that scraped at the walls Obito had built inside himself. When he first learned that Naruto carried the same dream he once did, to be Hokage, to protect everyone. Something in him twisted, not out of jealousy, not entirely, but out of a longing so ancient and buried it no longer had words. Because Naruto was what Obito might have been. A boy who believed, even when the world gave him every reason not to. A boy who refused to be broken. And that refusal ignited something dangerous. A reminder. Kakashi, too, was a wound that never healed. The boy who had once been cold and proud had grown into a man of sorrow and strength. Kakashi, who had killed the girl Obito loved, but had never stopped grieving for it. Kakashi, who still carried the Sharingan Obito had given him as a dying gift. When they finally met again, face to face, mask to mask, it was not a battle of strength. It was a battle of memory, of loss, of identity. Their fists carried the weight of years, of words left unspoken, of guilt that had calcified into silence. Kakashi begged him to remember who he was. Obito mocked him, but behind the derision, the cracks deepened. Naruto's voice, too, began to cut through the noise, not with anger, not with hate, but with a kind of clarity Obito had forgotten. Naruto didn't just fight him. He reached for him. He questioned him. He looked at him not as an enemy, but as someone who had lost his way. And when Naruto said he would never abandon his friends, not for any reason, Obito's mask felt heavier, because in those words he heard echoes of his own voice, long ago, saying much the same. But Obito was not ready to return. Not yet. Instead, he pressed forward, initiating the fourth great ninja war with a ferocity that shook the nations. He aligned with Kabuto, whose Edo Tensei army resurrected the fallen, turning the past into weapons. The battlefield became a graveyard of memory, where the living were forced to fight their dead. And still, Obito watched from above it all, guiding the chaos like a conductor. The moon's eye plan, his vision of infinite illusion, drew closer. The tailed beasts were gathered. The 10 Tails was born. And with it, the transformation began. Obito, broken boy, turned masked man, now became something else entirely. The Jinchuriki of the 10 Tails, a god in form, if not in heart. For a moment, he tasted that godhood, power that bent the world, light that burned through shadow. But even then, the ghosts would not leave him. He looked at Naruto and saw the boy he used to be. He looked at Kakashi and saw the friend he had lost. And most haunting of all, he saw Rin, not the Rin of death and sorrow, but the Rin who had once smiled at him in the sun. That image, that single moment of purity, cracked the divine illusion. It was not the force of jutsu or blades that began to undo Obito. It was memory, feeling, humanity. And then, as he stood on the cusp of reshaping reality, Naruto reached him again, not with strength, but with compassion. He told Obito that he understood the pain, that he too had lost people, that he had felt the same rage, the same desire to give up. But he had chosen a different path. And in that moment, Obito saw himself, not as he was, but as he might have been. A flicker, a chance. The battle raged on, but inside, something had begun to change. The infinite Tsukuyomi, his dream for a perfect world, started to lose its luster. It was not real. It was not true. It was an escape, not a solution. And for the first time in years, Obito began to doubt. Truly doubt. Not the world, but himself. Black Zetsu, sensing this fracture, turned on him. The puppet master was merely a puppet himself. Kaguya, the ancient origin of chakra, used his body as a vessel. And Obito, who had manipulated others for so long, now found himself manipulated, used, betrayed. In the darkness that followed, stripped of power, discarded like refuse, Obito finally saw the full picture. Not a world of peace, but a cycle of suffering perpetuated by lies, by pride, by fear. And he was part of it. No longer the hero, no longer the villain, just a man who had lost his way. But there is a strange power in clarity, even when it comes too late. From the edges of death, Obito rose not with rage, but with resolve. He chose one final time to act, not for revenge, not for himself, but to protect, to make amends. He saved Naruto from a fatal blow. He stood beside Kakashi in battle, not as an enemy, but as a comrade. And when the moment came to give everything, he did so without hesitation. His final act was not a war. It was a choice, a return to the boy he once was, the boy who dreamed. As his spirit faded, he spoke with Kakashi, not with venom, but with warmth. He apologized, not just for the wars and the deaths, but for the time they lost, for the friend he could have been, for the life he abandoned. And Kakashi, eyes heavy with sorrow, understood, because beneath the ruins, Obito was never a monster. He was a boy who had loved too deeply, who had hurt too long, who had been given every reason to give up, and had finally, at the very end, chosen something else. And so, Obito Uchiha, shinobi of the Hidden Leaf, student of Minato, friend of Kakashi, soul tethered to Rin, found peace not in conquest, but in surrender. Not in illusion, but in truth. A truth earned through pain, carved through memory, and sealed in sacrifice. And as his spirit dissolved into light, the world he had tried to remake slowly began to heal. The winds of war had begun to still, but the echoes of Obito's choices lingered in the minds of those who remained. His fall had been long, steep, and carved from anguish, but his rise, brief though it was left behind the faint shimmer of redemption. Those who watched him vanish knew not what to make of the man he had become. Some remembered only the mask, the deception, the blood spilled in the name of false peace. But others, especially Naruto and Kakashi, remembered something else. A boy, once full of light, twisted by grief, who had tried, in the end, to return to that light. The battlefield was quiet now, and yet full of ghosts. And among them, Obito's presence lingered, not in the form of terror, but in the stillness after storm, in the question that so few dared ask: what makes a villain? And who decides when one becomes a hero again? As the dust settled, Kakashi stood on the edge of memory, his thoughts drifting back to the boy who had once called him a comrade. So many years had passed since that tragic mission when everything changed. Rin's death had been the shatter point. But in truth, Obito's path had started to diverge even earlier. He had always been sensitive, always carried his heart too close to the surface. He wanted to be noticed. He wanted to be strong. But more than anything, he wanted to protect those he loved. That was what made his fall so cruel. The world hadn't broken a tyrant. It had broken a boy who loved too much and didn't know what to do with the pain when that love was torn away. Kakashi had carried the weight of that mission his entire life. He had blamed himself for Rin's death, for Obito's presumed death, and then again for Obito's return as the masked man who had plunged the world into chaos. But now, with Obito's final sacrifice fresh in his heart, the burden began to shift. Not because it had vanished, but because it had been shared. Obito had carried it too, in secret, in shadow, all this time. They had been two sides of the same wound, each dealing with it in their own way, one by burying it, the other by letting it consume him. And now, both had bled from it. Naruto, too, reflected on what had transpired. He was young, and yet the weight he bore was ancient. He had fought Obito not only with chakra and strength, but with understanding. He had seen the boy beneath the villain, had spoken to that part of him no one else dared address. And it made Naruto think of all the others: Gaara, Nagato, even Sasuke. People twisted by their circumstances, molded by a world that seemed to reward suffering with silence. Naruto wasn't naive. He didn't excuse their actions, but he saw the thread that bound them. They had all once been children with dreams. Obito had just been the one who stopped dreaming the soonest. And then, in the quiet hours after the final battle, Kakashi received a gift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. The Mangekyo Sharingan that Obito had once bestowed in a moment of dying loyalty had evolved, one final time. As if Obito, even in the afterlife, wanted to ensure that Kakashi would never stand alone. The chakra of the 6 paths briefly infused Kakashi's body, and for a fleeting time, he fought not as a mere shinobi, but as a legend, twin Mangekyō, Kamui made whole. It was not power for its own sake. It was power born of memory, of legacy, of something too complex for words. Obito's final wish wasn't to win. It was to protect the future he once sought to destroy. The young shinobi who had watched the war unfold, the new generation, would remember Obito in fragments, as a tale told in low voices around campfires, as a warning and a whisper. Some would know him only as the masked man who nearly doomed the world. Others would learn of his final choice and see in him a symbol of how far one could fall and still find the strength to rise again. And for Naruto, who now bore the hopes of the future in his hands, Obito would always be a mirror, not of who he was, but of who he might have become had he chosen differently. And in that mirror, Naruto found resolve. The story of Obito Uchiha is not a simple one. It doesn't begin and end with villainy. It weaves through love and grief, through hope and horror. He was never truly the monster he appeared to be. He was a child once. He laughed. He stumbled. He dreamed of being Hokage. He trained hard. He believed in his team. And when that world crumbled, he didn't become evil overnight. He mourned. He despaired. And then he chose a different path. Not because it was right, but because it hurt less than hope. Yet in the end, it was hope that called him back. A hope embodied by Naruto, carried by Kakashi, and whispered by Rin in the stillness of memory. His redemption didn't erase the pain he caused, but it gave his end meaning. It gave his soul peace. And perhaps, for a boy who lost everything, that was enough. The moon rose high over the battlefield, its light no longer a symbol of illusion, but of quiet clarity. The shinobi world would rebuild. Scars would fade. But the story of Obito Uchiha would endure, not just as a tale of pain, but as a reminder that even the deepest darkness can still find its way toward the dawn. In the aftermath of the Fourth Great Ninja War, the world was left to piece itself together, scarred and forever changed by the events that had unfolded. But amidst the grief and pain, there was hope. A fragile, yet enduring hope that had emerged from the ashes of Obito Uchiha's long and troubled journey. His story, once marked by darkness and rage, had come full circle, ending not in the annihilation he had once sought, but in a quiet redemption that echoed through the hearts of those who had fought beside him and against him. For Kakashi, the weight of his past with Obito was a burden that would never fully fade. The loss of his closest friend, the one who had once shared his dreams and his ideals, had been a wound that cut deeper than any physical injury. But over time, Kakashi had learned to carry that burden with a quiet dignity, understanding that the love they had shared in their youth was something that could never be erased. Even after Obito had fallen into the clutches of despair, even after the mask had been shattered and the truth had come to light. Kakashi knew that the bond they had shared was not something that could be easily forgotten. As Hokage, Kakashi stood at the forefront of a new era. He had witnessed the horrors of war and the toll it had taken on his comrades, on the village, and on the world itself. But he also saw the potential for change, for healing, and for growth. Obito's death had not been in vain. His final moments had been a testament to the power of redemption, to the possibility of change, no matter how far one had fallen. It was a lesson that Kakashi had learned all too well. And it was a lesson that he carried with him as he led the Hidden Leaf Village into a new age. Naruto, too, had learned from Obito's tragic story. In his own journey, Naruto had faced the darkness of despair, had been tempted by the idea of power and control, just as Obito had once been. But unlike Obito, Naruto had never lost sight of the belief that people could change, that love and friendship were powerful enough to overcome even the deepest of wounds. Naruto had always believed in the strength of bonds, and it was this belief that had driven him to save Sasuke, to stop Madara, and to bring peace to the world. In the aftermath of the war, Naruto often reflected on Obito's words, on the ideals that had once consumed his former friend. Obito had believed that the world could be shaped by his own vision, that peace could only be achieved by forcing others to bend to his will. But Naruto knew that true peace could only come from understanding, from mutual respect, and from the willingness to protect those you loved, no matter the cost. Obito had been a tragic figure, someone who had lost his way and fallen into darkness. But in his final act of sacrifice, he had shown Naruto the true meaning of peace, the peace that came from accepting the pain of the world and choosing to fight for a better future, no matter how difficult that fight might be. As the village began to rebuild, both Kakashi and Naruto found themselves drawn back to the quiet corners of their memories, where the faces of their fallen comrades lingered like ghosts. Obito's face, once hidden behind a mask, now stood clear in their minds, an image of both a friend lost and an enemy defeated. But it was also the face of someone who had finally come to terms with their own inner conflict, someone who had found a measure of peace in the final moments of their life. The world, despite the scars left behind by the war, had moved forward. The bonds of friendship and love, forged in the fires of battle and suffering, had endured. Obito's death, though painful, had not been in vain. His story had come to an end, but the lessons he had taught were carried forward by those who had loved him, by those who had fought against him, and by those who had witnessed the tragedy of his life. In the stillness of the night, when the village was quiet and the stars hung like distant beacons in the sky, Kakashi and Naruto often found themselves contemplating the life of Obito Uchiha, the man who had once stood alongside them, the man who had once been their friend, was gone. But his legacy his message would live on. Obito's story was one of both sorrow and redemption, a reminder that even the darkest paths could lead to the light if one was willing to face their own inner demons. The world, in its way, had healed, and in that healing, Obito's sacrifice had played a part, a crucial part. His pain, his loss, and his ultimate redemption had become a beacon of hope, a silent promise that even the most tragic of journeys could lead to peace. In the quiet moments that followed Obito's final act of redemption, the Hidden Leaf Village continued its slow, steady recovery. The world outside had moved on, but for those who had been closest to Obito, the scars of his journey lingered. For Kakashi, Naruto, and those who had fought alongside him, Obito was no longer just an enemy or a fallen comrade. He had become a part of their history, a symbol of the fragility of human resolve and the potential for even the deepest darkness to be transformed by light. The sun rose over the village each day, casting a warm, golden light on the streets and the homes of the villagers. The laughter of children echoed through the air, the sound of life continuing to pulse through the veins of the hidden leaf. But for those who had walked beside Obito, there was a quiet reverence for the lessons he had imparted. Lessons that could not be forgotten, no matter how much time passed. His journey was a reminder of the fine line between hope and despair, between the choices that defined a life and the regrets that followed them. Kakashi, now the Hokage, found himself often wandering through the village in the early hours of the morning, before the world fully awoke. He would visit the memorial stone, where the names of those who had given their lives for the village were etched in the cold stone. Obito's name had been added to that list, alongside those who had fought for the peace they had all dreamed of. For Kakashi, the weight of that stone was a constant reminder of the friend he had lost, the friend who had once stood beside him as a partner and as a dreamer, a man who had believed that a world free from pain was worth any price. Obito had, in many ways, been a reflection of Kakashi himself, a man whose path had been shaped by loss and grief, whose choices had been driven by the need to protect others, even at the cost of personal happiness. But while Kakashi had chosen a different path, one that allowed him to keep his humanity intact, Obito had lost himself in the pursuit of a peace that could only be achieved through destruction. It was a painful truth that Kakashi had come to understand all too well, and it was a lesson that he carried with him as he faced the challenges of being Hokage. Naruto, too, had been shaped by Obito's story. The boy who had once been an outcast, a symbol of the village's rejection, had become the hero who had saved the world. But even as he stood victorious, Naruto could not forget the lessons of the past. Obito's tale had shown him the consequences of losing oneself in the darkness, of allowing pain and sorrow to shape one's identity. It had also shown him that there was always a choice, that even the most twisted of paths could be redirected toward redemption if one was willing to face the truth and make the necessary sacrifices. Naruto often found himself reflecting on the bond he had shared with Obito. It was a bond that had been forged in the heat of battle, one that had been tested by pain, loss, and betrayal. And yet, in the end, it had been a bond that had led to understanding, a bond that had allowed Naruto to see Obito not just as an enemy, but as a man who had once dreamed of a better world, just as he had. It was a bond that Naruto knew would never be fully broken, no matter how far the paths of their lives had diverged. As the years passed, the village of the Hidden Leaf grew stronger, its people united by the sacrifices of those who had gone before them. The wounds of the past were slowly healed, but the memory of those who had fought and fallen in the struggle for peace remained alive in the hearts of those who had known them. The names of the fallen were honored, their stories passed down through the generations as a testament to the cost of the peace they now enjoyed. Obito's story, too, was passed down, an integral part of the history of the Hidden Leaf. His journey from a bright, hopeful youth to a man consumed by grief and revenge had become a cautionary tale, a story that was shared with the younger generations to remind them of the fragility of their own hopes and dreams. It was a story that spoke of the dangers of losing oneself in the pursuit of power, but also of the possibility of redemption, no matter how far one had fallen. In the years that followed, Naruto and Kakashi often found themselves standing together in the quiet of the village, watching as the next generation of shinobi trained and grew. They had both seen the horrors of war, had both lost comrades, friends, and loved ones along the way. But they had also seen the strength of the human spirit, the capacity for change, and the power of bonds that transcended even the greatest of tragedies. Obito had been the catalyst for many of the changes in their lives. His story had forced them to confront their own weaknesses, their own fears, and their own desires. And in doing so, it had made them stronger, more compassionate, and more determined to create a world that would not repeat the mistakes of the past. In the quiet of the night, when the village was still, and the stars above shimmered with the light of 1,000 distant worlds, Kakashi and Naruto would sometimes speak of Obito. They would share their memories of him, of the young man who had once been their friend, of the man who had become their enemy, and of the man who had, in the end, chosen redemption over destruction. And in those moments, as they reflected on the life of Obito Uchiha, they both knew that his legacy would live on, not just in the stories that were told, but in the lives of those who had learned from his mistakes. Obito's journey was one of tragedy, but it was also a journey of hope, a hope that, in the end, had been realized not through the destruction of the world, but through the choices made by those who had survived. It was a hope that had found its way into the hearts of those who had once been its enemies. And it was a hope that would continue to guide the world as it moved forward into a new era. As time moved forward, The legacy of Obito Uchiha was slowly woven into the fabric of the Hidden Leaf's history. He, the man who had been the architect of so much sorrow, had become something more in the eyes of those who came after him. A symbol not only of despair, but of the possibility of redemption, no matter how far one had fallen. His journey had been long, fraught with twists of fate, and the weight of choices that had shaped not only his own life, but the world itself. Kakashi's thoughts often drifted to Obito in the quiet moments of his leadership. As Hokage, he carried the mantle of responsibility with quiet pride. But there were days when the burdens of his position seemed almost too much to bear. And on those days, he would remember Obito, not the man who had sought to destroy everything, but the friend he had lost long before he could understand the man's true pain. Their friendship had been a bond forged in youth, in dreams of a brighter future that had been crushed under the weight of ambition and tragedy. But in the end, it was that very bond that had allowed Kakashi to understand the depths of Obito's sorrow, and to forgive the man who had once been his closest companion. Naruto, too, would think of Obito in his quieter moments. As the seventh Hokage, his days were filled with the work of maintaining peace and ensuring that the future would be brighter for the generations that followed. But it was in those rare, introspective times that he would remember the lessons that had been taught by the older generation. He had never fully known Obito as a person, but he had understood the man's heart. Obito's story had taught him that even the darkest of paths could be changed, even if the price for that change was everything. The world had been saved, and the hidden leaf had emerged from the flames of war, stronger than ever. But there would always be those who remembered the sacrifices made along the way. And among those sacrifices, Obito's stood out. His was a story of a man who had been lost, who had hurt others, and who had ultimately found the strength to redeem himself. In doing so, he had helped to shape the future of the world, ensuring that it would not fall into the same darkness he had once embraced. Obito's final moments, those moments in which he reached out to Kakashi, acknowledging the pain he had caused and the friendship he had once held dear, were etched into the minds of those who had witnessed them. It had been a quiet, unassuming moment of clarity, a reflection of the truth that even the most tortured soul could find peace in the end. His death was not just the end of a life. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun with dreams and ended with the quiet resolution of a man who had finally accepted the weight of his choices. As the days turned into months and years, Obito's story became a whispered tale passed down to younger generations of a man who had fought for peace, lost his way, and ultimately found redemption. It was a story that served as a reminder to all who heard it that the world was not defined by the mistakes of the past, but by the choices made in the present. Even in the darkest of times, there was always the potential for a new beginning, and Obito had proven that, even if only in the final moments of his life. For Kakashi, Naruto, and all those who had known Obito, the man's story would remain a part of them. It would shape their decisions, guide their actions, and remind them of the fragile nature of the human heart. Obito had been a man of great contradictions, but in his final act, he had embodied the ultimate truth, that even the most broken of souls could find peace, and that sometimes redemption could come only through sacrifice. And so, as the years continued to unfold, the village prospered under the leadership of those who had known loss, pain, and the possibility of healing. Obito's legacy lived on not just in the actions of his friends, but in the hearts of those who had learned from his journey. In the quiet corners of the hidden leaf, in the spaces between missions and meetings, in the small, everyday moments of life, the lessons of Obito Uchiha would echo forever. His story was not one of mere tragedy, but of hope, of a man who had fallen into darkness, but had risen again to offer his life in service of a greater cause. A man who had once dreamed of creating a perfect world, and who had ultimately understood that such a world could only exist through the shared strength of those willing to fight for it. It was a story that transcended the boundaries of time and space, a story that would live on in the hearts of the shinobi, who would carry it with them into the future. And as the night deepened, and the stars cast their gentle light upon the world, the echoes of Obito's final words lingered in the air, a soft whisper that would never be forgotten. The world is not perfect, but it's there for us, doing the best it can. That's what makes it so damn beautiful.